Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 13 of Astronomy Geoscience 160. This week, we're going to start talking about thinking about life outside of our solar system. And the first segment of lecture 22 is going to cover planetary temperature. So basically, the question that we're going to try to get at in this lecture is what determines the temperature of planets? And eventually, what we'll talk about after this is what determines the habitability of planets, because of course, temperature is an important characteristic that makes a planet hospitable to life or inhospitable to life. So, as we all know, the Earth is warm because it's heated by the sun. We all know this intuitively. If we go outside and feel the sunlight on our skin, we can feel the warmth. And this is why our planet is a nice place to be. How do we calculate how warm Earth is because of the sun? Why is the Earth not so warm that it's basically too hot for us to live? And the basic idea behind how we calculate what the temperature of the Earth is and why the Earth has this particular temperature is based on the idea that warm objects emit black body radiation. So we've talked about this before several times. If you have something that's warm, it will glow. And even if it's not glowing in the visible light, it may be glowing in infrared light that is at longer wavelengths than our eyes can see. So you can see these hot stovetops are glowing red. Something slightly cooler may be glowing in infrared light. So we wouldn't necessarily see it with our eyes, but it is emitting light. And basically what happens is that the Earth gets warmer by the sun, and then because it's warm, it emits light of its own. But the light that Earth emits is at a longer wavelength because the Earth itself is not as warm as the sun. The sun has a temperature of about 5,700 degrees, and the Earth's temperature is only about 300 degrees Kelvin. So because the Earth's temperature is so much lower, it emits all of its light at longer wavelengths out in the infrared. And the key distinction, the key idea here is that the amount of light that Earth receives must equal the amount that it emits. Otherwise, Earth would keep heating up or cooling down forever. So think about it like this. If I'm trying to keep my planet at the same temperature, I have to make sure that the amount of heat that I give in is exactly the same as the amount of heat that's being let off. Otherwise, if I keep adding more heat than is being let off, then Earth will keep heating up and heating up and heating up. If you have a balance, things stay the same. You can think about it in the same way as you can think about these pots. We can see here that in this fountain, there's water flowing from each of these pots into the next pot, into the next pot. If I look at this pot here, I can know that the amount of water entering that pot is equal to the amount of water leaving that pot. If there was more water entering than leaving, that pot would the water level in that pot would rise and rise and rise and eventually overflow. And if it were the other way around, eventually there would be no water in that pot and it would just dry up. And basically all of the water will have gone to the next pot. But because we see this happening and we see this steady, we know that the amount of water entering the pot must be equal to the amount of water leaving the pot. So we can use these principles to calculate what we call the equilibrium temperature of a planet. Now, this is the equation that lets us calculate this. We're not going to ask you to calculate anything with this equation, but you may need to know how the different factors that go into the equilibrium temperature affect the outcome. So over here on the left side is the temperature of the planet. We call this the equilibrium temperature. Equilibrium because it means that the amount of heat coming in is equal to the amount of heat coming out. It is balanced, it's in equilibrium. So the factors that affect the temperature of a planet are the temperature of the star. That makes sense, right? The hotter the sun is, the more light it will shine, the hotter the planet will become. The size of the star, the bigger the star is, the more light it emits, and therefore the hotter the planet. The distance from the star, now you can see that the distance is underneath this fraction. So the bigger the distance from the planet to the star, the less warm the planet will be. The larger the distance, the cooler the planet. That makes sense too, right? You've probably been around a fire and you can feel that if you're very close to the fire, you can feel the warmth on your face. But if you go further away, you don't get that warmth anymore. Exactly the same thing is happening here. And the other factor that matters is something called the albedo. This is basically a measure of how reflective the planet is. If the planet reflects a lot of light, it'll be cooler. If it absorbs all of the light that it gets, it will be warmer. You may have noticed this happening when you get into a car on a sunny day. Here are two cars that are identical. They're placed outside in the sun, and we're looking at them with this infrared camera. So this is an image from an infrared camera of this scene here. And you can see these two identical cars. One of them is black and one of them is white. The one that is black is warmer. It seems to be hotter on this infrared camera, which is measuring the temperature of the car. And that's because the black is more absorbent. Black absorbs all of the light that's coming in, whereas the white car reflects most of that light away. And as a result, the white car is cooler than the black car, even though they're getting the same amount of sunlight. So if we go back to that equation and we plug in values for the Earth, we get approximately 255 Kelvin for what the temperature of the Earth should be, or about -1 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty cold. Like, it's not too far off. You know, over the winter in Wisconsin, we definitely get to that temperature, but that's not the average temperature of all year round over the entire surface of the Earth. Overall, Earth's temperature is about 288 Kelvin on average, or about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So why is there a difference between what we calculate with this equation and what we actually find to be the case? And the answer is that Earth's atmosphere blankets us somewhat. So what's going on is that Earth's atmosphere is transparent to some flavors of light and opaque to other flavors. So if you look outside with visible light like we see with our eyes, the atmosphere is basically transparent. You can look as far as you want. You can look out into space even. You can see stars with our own naked eyes without really having to do anything special. So the atmosphere is very transparent to light in the visible range. But it turns out that that's not necessarily the case in the infrared. Our atmosphere blocks a lot of light that's infrared. And this fact is what causes Earth to be warmer. So the fact that Earth's atmosphere is transparent to visible light, the kind of light that's emitted by hot objects like the sun emits most of its light in the visible because it's warm. It's got a temperature of almost 6,000 degrees Kelvin. But the Earth blocks most of the light that it emits. So Earth emits light down here that is redder on a longer wavelength. This is a plot showing the amount of light given off by objects of different temperature as a function of wavelength. So the amount of light is on the y-axis and the wavelength is on the x-axis. So Earth emits less light overall because it's cooler, and redder light out in the infrared because it's cooler. And the peak of Earth's blackbody emission is around 10 microns, so longer wavelengths than what we see with our naked eyes. And Earth's atmosphere blocks much of this radiation. So instead of it being a purely balanced system where the amount of light that is absorbed by the Earth or that encounters the Earth from the sun is exactly balanced by the amount of light that's emitted because of the Earth's warmth, a little bit of that emitted light is blocked back. So let's zoom in on this picture here. So now I've added this layer of atmosphere. Some of the light that Earth emits, this black body light, is released out into space. It essentially goes freely away and cools the Earth off. But a little bit of this light is reflected back by the atmosphere, and it hits the Earth again, and it warms the Earth just a little bit more than our original calculation implied. So Earth's atmosphere traps this extra heat that's being given off by the Earth and makes us a little bit warmer than we would have been otherwise. This is called the greenhouse effect. So if you've ever been inside of a greenhouse, basically the same thing happens. Just like our atmosphere, glass is transparent to visible light, but opaque to infrared light. So if you have a greenhouse on a cold day, it will be warmer inside the greenhouse than outside because the glass is trapping that heat inside. The greenhouse effect is a good thing. This is why our planet is habitable. If the greenhouse effect weren't there, we'd all be very cold and our Earth would probably be in a snowball state, just covered with ice all over the place. but there can be too much of a good thing. So what is it about our atmosphere that makes it opaque in the infrared? Why is light able to pass through our own atmosphere in the visible without hindrance, but when it gets to the infrared light, it loses a lot? And the answer is that there are spectral lines. So recall that different elements and different molecules absorb light at different wavelengths. It turns out that there are molecules that have many, many, many absorption bands in the infrared. And these molecules here, such as ozone, oxygen, water, carbon dioxide, methane, here's another ozone, all of these contribute to this warming effect because they're blocking the light that's being emitted by our own Earth that's essentially escaping out into space. If you have more of these molecules, then you will block more light. So if you add some carbon dioxide or some ozone to the atmosphere, it will cause the transparency of the atmosphere to decrease, and therefore the amount of light blocked by our atmosphere to increase, and therefore our planet to get warmer. So we've actually seen this effect on our own planet over the past century. Here's a graph showing the average global temperature of the Earth over the last about 150 years or so. And you can see that there's been this steady rise. You can see fluctuations, these average years, they bounce back and forth. But overall, you can see that clearly something is changing and something is causing the Earth to become warmer. Here's what this graph looks like when we zoom out and look for many, many years before we even started recording temperatures with thermometers. We can actually go back into the geological record and figure out what the temperature must have been to give the oceans similar chemistry to what we see. And we can see that while the temperature of our Earth has been bouncing around and gets higher and lower on occasion, it's a relatively slow process until these last 100 years or so, when you start to see this very rapid rise in the temperature of the Earth. Meanwhile, we've also been monitoring the concentration of greenhouse gases. In this case, I'm showing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of our planet. So this is data from about 60 years showing how the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is rising steadily over the course of that time. You can see every year there's a little wiggle back and forth. This is because forests and absorb carbon dioxide during part of the year when they're producing leaves. And we have more forests in the northern hemisphere. So in the northern hemisphere summer, there's less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and in the winter there's more. So that changes every year. But overall, even with that change back and forth due to forestation, you can see that there's this long trend upwards in the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And this has been going on another very sudden change. So we can look back for almost a billion years in the geological record and figure out how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere over that time. And you can see that there are these big changes, but nothing nearly as large and nothing nearly as fast as what we've experienced in the last 100 years or so. You can see this very large spike at the end, which is basically the last 100 years of change. We can zoom in a little bit more on the more recent data, and you can see that things were moving along pretty steadily for the last 1,000 years or so. But there was a change right around 1700 when the amount of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere started to increase much more rapidly, exponentially almost. This corresponds roughly to the time of the Industrial Revolution. So what's going on here, we think, is that by burning hydrocarbons, such as the factories that became prevalent during the Industrial Revolution, where you take coal, oil, gas, and etc., and you burn them to produce energy, that releases carbon dioxide as a byproduct, which explains why we see this sharp increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere since that time. Now, the question is, does this change in carbon dioxide that we're seeing match up, and is it the cause of the change in temperature of our oceans that we see? And this is a tricky question to answer. The best way that we have to do this is to use what's called a general circulation model. This is a really sophisticated model to understand what our climate is doing and how our climate responds to different changes. And what it does is it grids up the Earth into layers on the ocean, layers on the water, little grid cells here. You can see these grids all over the surface of our ocean and our surface of our land. And it also grids the atmosphere into these little cubes. And basically it models how different effects and different conditions change and how they feed back into each other as we add more carbon dioxide into our atmosphere or not. So you can make these general circulation models and you can ask them to predict how things are going to change under different assumptions about how carbon dioxide is being released into our atmosphere or how it's not. It turns out that these general circulation models are pretty good. These are measurements of the temperature of our Earth, these colored lines here, and these gray lines that are popping up are predictions from these GCMs, these climate models. And you can see that when you ask these models to predict what's going to happen in the future, they actually match pretty well what was actually measured. So for example, these very first ones, these models that were done in the 1970s, were able to model this general trend, even from 1975 out until the current time, until the year about 2015. And you can see that this line here is the time at which those models were made. So they're all doing a pretty good job of predicting how the climate on our planet is changing. So the question then is, can these models reproduce our climate? Can they make these accurate predictions without the presence of any carbon dioxide added by humans? Are humans contributing to the changing climate? And the general consensus is yes. Without having the additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from human activity, these climate models can't predict what the temperature of the Earth will be. So you can see here, this is a model of the temperature. The temperatures are shown in these black lines here, and the model is shown in red and orange. And these models do a good job of matching what we see if we allow it to include the effects of carbon dioxide added into the atmosphere by humans. But if we don't let it use the carbon dioxide added by humans, it doesn't predict this rise that we see over the last 40 years or so. It just can't match this rise without adding in additional greenhouse gases. So the global circulation models strongly indicate that the change in temperature that we observe on Earth is caused by the change in greenhouse gas production and the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So to summarize all of this evidence, we have determined that there is an increase in temperature and an increase in carbon dioxide fraction of Earth's atmosphere. They're taking place at the same time, and they're both much faster than any previous changes to Earth's atmosphere that we've seen in the geological record. We have a plausible explanation for why an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere would affect the temperature. Basically, we know that the greenhouse effect should increase as we add more greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. We have a good reason to explain why carbon dioxide is increasing in Earth's atmosphere, which is that industrial emissions have started producing lots and lots of carbon dioxide, especially in the last couple of centuries, and we've seen that increase since then. We have a model of our entire climate system that can reproduce this data and can accurately predict the climate decades into the future. So we think we have a good handle on the physics of what's going on in our atmosphere. And finally, we've done tests to show that these accurate models cannot accurately predict what would be going on unless we let them use the fact that there's additional carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere. So without this additional carbon dioxide added in, these models can't accurately model the data. So all of this leads scientists to one of two conclusions. We have either the devil's advocate theory, which is that we just have been very, very unlucky. So imagine that perhaps the temperature increase is not related to the increase in carbon dioxide, and that we just happen to be living in a time where these unusual sudden changes are happening. And the reason that our models need the carbon dioxide to be increasing to increase the temperature is because there's some missing physics or something we're just not understanding properly going on in them. And we're just happen to be lucky that if we put in these additional constraints, if we add in this additional carbon dioxide, then we get the right answers. This seems like a stretch. We've been very careful, and we've basically been able to do controlled experiments with these climate models and show what's going on. It's always possible that we're missing something, but almost all scientists at this point think that the far likelier explanation is that humans, and in particular our industrial emissions, are driving an increase in the planet's temperature by increasing the greenhouse effect. This is the simpler explanation, and it's generally accepted. So this is basically the argument for why humans seem to be affecting the climate of our planet. It's a little bit humbling to know that we can do this with only a few centuries worth of work and adding in the amount of greenhouse gases. And it's a little bit daunting to think about how we may try to solve it, but we should remember that if we were able to create this problem in the first place, then we have the technology and we have the ability to change our planet in other ways. And there are ways for us to solve this problem and get back to the stable climate that we've enjoyed for millions of years beforehand. So after that note, I'm going to finally wrap up by saying the amount of work that scientists have put into understanding the climate and models on Earth have made it possible to ask similar questions about the habitability of other planetary systems. Just like you can grid up the surface of the Earth and the atmosphere of the Earth into these GCMs, we can run similar models of planets and other systems and learn how different stellar environments, how different amounts of light from their stars, different colors of light from their stars change the way climates will behave. And we'll talk about that in the next segment of the lecture when we start thinking about what it means to be in the habitable zone of a star outside of our solar system.